I would take the national championship at college football over the World Series, but I want to sing one day. If you ask me what I want to sing, anything. The Star Spangled Banner is pretty wide range, but I love to sing. So I was actually a voice major in college. A lot of people didn't know that. But today, Roddy and I want to talk to you. We're an interesting pair. Roddy, the professor, and Melanie, the motivator. I want you to feel something at the end of this. Every time I speak, I always try to have you feel something. I'm okay with it being anger. I'm okay with it being fear, inspiration, motivation, energy. I want you to feel something. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about sample sourcing. And before you close your minds and your hearts and your ears, understand that sampling is the foundation of everything we do and all of the innovation that you're going to hear over the next couple days. And so we want to talk to you openly, transparently about some of the things that have changed over the last couple years that you might not be aware of.
Yeah. And so as we started thinking about this, one of the things that, as Mel and I were talking about, what are we going to talk about at IIeX? There was a lot of talk at, this conference and other conferences about innovation, but we felt like there was, a lack of talk, open discussion about, what's at the core of what we do. And so we started to think, it's really a black box. A lot of our clients, and even honestly our colleagues, don't really understand a lot of the stuff that really fundamentally underpins what we do. We started to talk about it a little bit more like, is it really a black box? Well, it's more like Pandora's box when we think about it. So nod your head if you remember Pandora's box from your classics course or, mythology in high school or something like that. So if you remember the story of Pandora, Pandora is really, I'll skip a lot here, but Pandora's not really supposed to open the box. And she opens a box and all sorts of unseemly things start to come out. And then she frantically tries to get them back in and not successfully so. So we want to talk a little bit about some of those things. Not all of them are necessarily unseemly things. But when you open up this box of where participants come from, what do we actually find? So we'll talk about 4 things today. First, how do we connect with people? And this is all about people. People underpin our research. We forget about that sometimes. What do we do with them? How do we qualify people? And then what are some potential signs of trouble that should ask you to ask more questions about where your data is coming from?
So first, how do we connect with people? There are 2 main forms of connecting with people, open recruitment and closed recruitment. And everything sort of falls in the spectrum of open to closed recruitment. On your left, you'll see that the first form is of open recruitment, and people use they use online advertisements to gather people. This is a very open style. Anyone can happen across it. Anyone can click on it. Anyone can come in. They don't know much about you when you come into the frame. And it's a little bit open to gaming and to being deduped and to bots. And the open recruitment forms are very open to. I like what Grant said. In today's world, it can be hard to find danger. Open recruitment has more danger associated with it, so you need to make sure that you're working with a partner that understands those dangers and builds plans in to protect you from them. The second way is to actually integrate with websites. There's 2 ways to integrate with websites. One is an open form, again, but one is a closed form. So when you're integrating with websites and you're just putting advertisements right on the website or open links, reusable links right on the website, that's an open form of recruitment. But you can do it in a closed form as well. You can integrate behind a member page wall. You can integrate after they actually sign in with a username and a password. So those closed recruitments are better ways of making sure that people have logged in with real credentials. And then the final way is through brand lists. You actually partner with companies like P&G or US Bank or American Airlines, and you work with their loyalty lists, you work with their member databases, and you give them one-off invitations, closed recruitment. They can't get into your site any other way other than to be invited. And so the 2 spectrums, open recruitment and closed recruitment. Open recruitment has more danger and requires a lot more investment in the technology. Closed recruitment is a bit more expensive, and you need to understand what you're buying when you're buying your sample frame.
And then, in direct relation to this is sort of how we're recruiting people or what do we actually do with them. Thinking about the open recruitment model that Melanie mentioned, what we're usually doing here is trying to conduct research with people in real time or near real time because we connect with them, we engage with them, we may not see them again. We're trying to, we're going to pre-screen them. I'll come back to pre-screening in just a second. And then they become traffic, and we're engaged with them in that way. In the closed recruitment model, we're trying to build a relationship with people that's a longer one. We'll profile people when they're initially engaged and they join a community or a panel, some at once, and then again over time. Those people will be engaged with over time. They can be recontacted, and there's sort of a relationship that builds and not just a one-off, but in sort of engaging these people over time. And so, again, as Mel mentioned, it's important to understand what potential differences lie from both of those.
And there's a place for both of these, but the important part is to understand what you're buying. There's a lot of sharing that goes on in the traffic world when you're not actually bringing them into a panel. You need to understand that when you're generating just raw, unknown traffic, and then you're getting to know that traffic in real time, there's actually a lot of sharing of traffic that goes on in the sample space. So you should be asking your partners, how much of your sample is your own? How much do you know? How much do you know about these people? And how much is shared with other sample providers in the space? So then how do we get people to participate? So email is not dead. A lot of people think that email is dead. It is not. The CPR report by the Green Book actually said that 80% of people are still coming into surveys through email. But we're also bringing people in through apps, browser plugins where you log in and you get an alert, and then there's survey walls and member pages. This is important too. There's an awful lot of academic research that goes out, and every academic paper wants to know response rates. In a world where people are getting emails, response rates are easy to calculate. In a world with apps, browser plugins, survey walls, and member pages, response rates can be much more difficult to create. And so you need to make sure you're working through the math with your partners. If they're giving you a response rate, is it a response rate of the panel? Is it a response rate of the segment of the audience that you're surveying? Is it a response rate for your survey? And if they're using any of these other ways to get people in, how are they accounting for it?
And so, Mel talked about a few ways of engaging with people. And so once we engage with them, there are certain things that we have to do in terms of qualifying them to make sure they're the people that are fit for doing research with us. So one thing that we oftentimes do is target them. So if, again, the closed recruitment model or a panel model where we know things about people, we can use what we know about them to point them in the direction of a survey that they would qualify for. Because, again, we have those known attributes that allow us to be efficient there when we're doing that. If we know a little bit less about people, we pre-screen. We pre-screen, in the panel or closed recruitment model too. But if we certainly don't know enough about people or that we need to sort of target them, we'll ask people a series of questions. So, a few things to consider when you're pre-screening people or when this is part of your methodology. Is that, you're going to ask people oftentimes a fair amount of questions. There's a little bit of participant burden there at the beginning, but there also is a potential bias depending on what types of questions you're asking them and how many questions you're asking them before they ever make it into the survey itself. And then another thing that's important that I think is oftentimes overlooked is simply how you're messaging people. An example of this, going back to the email example, is what are you telling people about the research or about the survey before they ever engage? I know at Research Now, we spent some time over the past year thinking about how we message people just in subject lines. What are we going to tell them? Not trying to put something in a subject of a survey saying it's just a survey about consumer electronics or about, specific business decision making. That even by inviting them to the survey, we're telling them a little bit more about what they're in for and potentially how they can qualify for that survey and biasing the results. Other things that we might, commonly think about in terms of incentives and offering high incentives and how those are messaged up front when we're engaging with people to first participate in the survey all ultimately impact the results. But perhaps the biggest thing and the least talked about thing is routing. Maybe it's a surprise, or maybe it's not a surprise. I don't know. Basically, every company that you work with who's a data collection partner uses a router. So I think it's worth talking a little bit more, and no person better to talk about that than Mel, so I'll let you talk about routers a little bit.
Yeah, so routing, as Roddy said, everybody's using a router, and they need to be open with you about this. There are a couple different kinds of routers. How many of you are familiar with routers in the audience today? Not a lot. There are a couple of different kinds of routers. The first kind is a parallel router and a serial router. One router asks a bunch of questions up front for all the studies that you might qualify for, and then picks one based on actual qualification and pushes you to it. That router, that parallel router, asks a bunch of questions, and those questions can impact the survey results that you get when you get to the end because you've asked them a bunch of questions that have changed their frame of mind. It can also affect awareness data. If you're asking a whole bunch of questions before they ever get to this survey, you need to just know that that's the kind of router that's being used. The other kind is a serial router. It's a little bit more of a burden on the panelists because you go in and out of surveys, qualifying for them one at a time, but it can provide less bias. And then it's important to understand how many times people are passing in and out. So your partner needs to be talking to you about their router. Do they use a router? The answer should be yes. Almost every sample company I know of, and I've been in this a long time, is using a router now. And then what kind of router is it? How do they choose which questions to put in this parallel path, and how do they choose which surveys to give them in a one-off serial fashion? Now, how do they choose them is usually a combination of either weighted randomization or priority. There are two kinds of router algorithms. The weighted randomization uses some sort of randomization, some amount of randomization, along with some weighting to try to get the member into the right survey. Priorities are pure priority-based. They're going to push them to the survey that's the most profitable for the company. In a priority-based world, you need to be careful, because if you've got a bunch of high-dollar B2B studies, they'll sit at the top of the router, and they'll eke out all of the B2B people before they get down to the less profitable surveys. All of your ailments will sit at the top. All of your B2B studies will sit at the top. All of your low incidence work will sit at the top. And then the work down at the bottom will be missing all of those people. The other problem with that type of a router is you can't replicate it. Every day, what's at the top will change, and what gets down to the bottom will change. So you need an amount of randomization in your router. So if you're not talking to your partner about what kind of router they're using, then these are the questions that you need to be asking. Finally, you need to know, guess what? There are levels in a lot of routers. There's a highest priority level, a middle layer, and a remnant layer. So you'll get your highest priority project sitting at the top. A lot of companies will put trackers up there, which seems like a great thing, but then all those trackers take away from the ad hoc sample that's sitting in the middle. And then you've got a middle layer, which is where some of the sort of day-to-day ad hoc projects sit, and you've got a remnant layer. If I can't qualify you for anything else, I'm gonna push you to this remnant layer, and I'm gonna treat you like traffic and push you out to surveys through APIs. You need to understand, when you're buying sample from your partner, what layer? Do they have layers? What layer of the router are you sitting in, and what amount of bias is being brought into your study as a result of those decisions? So I hope you're feeling a little bit of anxiety. I want you to know what sample companies are doing, and I want you to be armed to ask the right questions.
And so, one of the things that we're getting at here is we're thinking about all these issues. There are some problems. If there weren't potential problems, we wouldn't really be up here talking. So, we want to talk really quickly about some of the indicators and things that you might be seeing in your data that might cue you into maybe the fact that you should ask some more questions. One is open ends. I've been doing some research on open ends recently, and one of the things I found is maybe not a huge surprise, but that people aren't necessarily using open ends as much as they might have them in their survey, but sometimes they're not even looking at them or considering them. If that's you, then maybe you should think about if you should be asking them at all, but I'd argue that you should, because open ends can be a key indicator of data quality. I'm going to be the last guy to tell you that you should throw someone out of your data set because they gave you one poor open end, but open ends oftentimes are a key. If you're seeing something that it's gibberish or shows someone doesn't speak the language they're supposed to be speaking, that's a problem. Also, overstatement. So let's say you're doing research and you're trying to target Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Well, not necessarily going to be this guy. He might tell you he is, but he's not really. He also might be this survey superhero, this person who doesn't really exist, the person who is going to say, I'm aware of every brand ever. Is that necessarily the case? Probably not. So if you're seeing awareness lift for your brand and lift overall, it's worth asking questions about the source of your data and where this overstatement's coming from.
So the last two are that the data doesn't line up. I love purses. One of the things you look at when you go and you buy a purse to make sure it's real, you look at the stitching, make sure the stitching lines up. Same with your data. Your data should line up with prior waves. It should line up with benchmarks. It should line up with your gut, your intuition in the market. If your data's not lining up, you might have an issue with some of the things that we talked about earlier. And then finally, quota spikes. If you're seeing spikes in traffic that are not the result of heroic efforts from your panel partner, they're not pushing a bunch of email invitations out. If the quota spikes are coming just through traffic spikes, you might need to worry about bots or about traffic coming from other parts of the world than were expected. So when you see those four types of things, they're indicators that you need to be asking more questions of your panel partner.
And so we talked about a few things, or reasons why there may be potential problems and questions to ask, and Pandora's box and all these things open up. But if you remember the Pandora's box story, what's left when everything else flies out is hope. And so, I think that, there is hope for us. We're not trying to dispel a message of doom and gloom. We're trying to wake you up a little bit and say you should be asking these questions. But if we start asking the right questions and we start treating people as we should and understanding where they're coming from, then ultimately, I think it is a hopeful message.
Okay, great. Thank you.